World War II is raging. Countless troops are in combat areas across Europe, while countries are turned into flaming battlefields. And you're in a resort town, sipping a cocktail on a beach, not a soldier in sight. How did some countries manage to stay neutral amid the biggest war in human history? More than 80% of the world's countries chose a side during World War II, with the vast majority siding with the Allies against the Axis, especially after the attack on Pearl Harbor got most of the Americas into the war. But some stayed stubbornly neutral, refusing to get involved and often making themselves a safe zone amid the chaos. While it worked out for some of them, others found that neutrality only lasted as long as the powerhouses said it did. That was the case for the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Estonia and Latvia bordered Russia, while Lithuania bordered Nazi-occupied Poland, and they all figured that their position between the powers was secure thanks to the German-Russian peace deal that Hitler and Stalin signed. They passed neutrality laws in 1938 as tensions were ramping up in the region and hoped to keep peace in their oceanfront countries no matter how big the war got. The problem was they were prime real estate, and it wasn't long before they found out that neutrality doesn't mean you won't get invaded. The first invasion was technically not a part of World War II, as the Soviet Union continued its annexation spree and declared all three countries part of their territory. They were compelled to allow Soviet military bases on their soil, but the Soviets were largely content to let the Baltic states follow the model of the Finnish Democratic Republic. It wasn't long before the noose started to tighten. The Soviets accused the Baltic states of collaboration with enemy powers, and the demands soon increased. The smaller countries largely conceded to the demands, and the autonomy they had was soon gone. But trying to stay out of World War II was about to take another turn. In 1941, Hitler made the infamous decision to invade the Soviet Union, which many historians believe was a key factor in his downfall. But the easiest way into Russia proper was to invade the Baltic states, and the Nazis soon put all three under military occupation. By this point, the Soviets were brutally repressing the population of the Baltic states, deporting those they designated as enemies, and many Baltic residents even viewed the German army as liberators. It didn't quite work out that way, as the Nazis soon began targeting the Jewish residents and anti-Nazi elements within the country brutally. So why didn't the Baltic states declare war on either party? The three countries suffered brutally under the Soviet and Nazi occupations, and the Soviet army would later take back control in the last days of the war and firmly incorporate the states into the Soviet Union. While there were many deportations and executions, forced conscriptions, and major food shortages, none of the countries were directly targeted as enemies by the occupying armies. With no manpower to fight back against the two powerhouse nations, staying neutral was a way to minimize the damage of occupation and hope to survive the war. But it wasn't only the Axis powers and the Soviets that invaded neutral countries. Iceland had a lot of advantages when it came to World War II. For one thing, it wasn't on the European mainland. In fact, it was the most far-flung country in Europe. It wasn't rich in natural resources that would invite an invasion, and it wasn't a useful platform to attack another country. It also wasn't technically an independent nation, being a sovereign kingdom under Denmark. While Germany quickly invaded Denmark and occupied it, the Kingdom of Iceland declared itself neutral. They cut military spending, reached out to the also neutral United States at the time, and kept open trade with both sides. But as the war ramped up, some powers didn't like that. What little goods were produced in Iceland were still sold to Germany despite the naval blockade against Nazi powers. Great Britain wanted to starve out the Nazis and reached out to Iceland to get them to stop, but Iceland refused. Seeing Iceland's continued diplomatic relations with Germany worried the British, and they eventually made the unilateral decision to invade Iceland and place it under Allied occupation. The island nation's small military force made them easy to conquer with a team of 746 Royal Marines. So how didn't this trigger a war for Iceland? Simple, the Allies didn't quite treat it like an invasion. From the start, the UK and later the United States claimed that they were occupying the island to ensure the Germans didn't take control of its important shipping lanes. Iceland didn't resist the occupation, but maintained its neutrality and avoided conflict with either party. While no combat took place directly on the island, the water surrounding the island became more and more dangerous. Many Icelandic fishermen lost their lives due to drifting mines in the surrounding waters. The occupation was lifted at the end of the war, but the experience was a key part in Iceland deciding to declare itself an independent republic in 1944. But some countries managed to make the most of their neutrality. The Nordic nations, the most northern mainland nations in Europe, had planned to stay neutral in any new world war that lasted as long as it took for Finland to get invaded by the Soviet Union. Sweden, wanting to avoid the same fate, changed its designation to non-belligerent, who could get involved with either party of the war but not to be involved in the combat. This allowed its air force to defend certain areas of Finland and maintain regular diplomatic relations with members of both parties. This would not only protect Sweden, but it would turn out to be a lifesaver for many. Sweden had only a small military following World War I and had no chance of resisting a German invasion. Thus, Sweden allowed Germany free passage for its troops through its territory at certain points and also provided them with a vital supply of iron ore. Sweden's status as non-belligerent kept them out of combat, but that was only going to last as long as they were useful to the Nazi powers. Over the course of the war, the Swedish armed forces were slowly building up, and by 1943 they were ready. They cut off their deals with Germany. Hitler was enraged, as he usually was, and considered invading. But Sweden turned out to be one of the Allies' secret weapons. While Swedish forces never went to war against either side, they had been secretly helping the Allies in many ways. They tried to warn the Soviets of the coming German invasion, but were ignored. And in 1943, when Germany began plans to deport and kill Denmark's Jewish population, Sweden's position as a neutral power was critical. The Danes were able to quietly ship their Jewish population to Sweden, where Germany couldn't get to them. As the war began drawing to a close, Sweden was prepared to aid the Allies in an invasion of liberation in Norway and Denmark, but the war came to a close before they had to change their neutral status. But some countries used the neutral label in very different ways. Switzerland had one of the longest streaks of neutrality of any country in the world, mostly due to two reasons. For one, the small country is located near the Alps, making it very hard to invade. Second, it maintains a large standing army through conscription, having one of the largest armies in the world per capita. Any attempt by the Nazis to occupy and conquer Switzerland would take much more effort than the small nation was worth strategically, so various armies decided it would be much easier to just go around it. But it also had value to the different powers in different ways. Switzerland was important strategically because it was a massive banking hub, holding money and assets from around the world. If the Nazis invaded, they could plunder the world's riches, which would permanently damage Switzerland's reputation as a haven for wealth. This would later be the source of much controversy over Switzerland's role in the war. They didn't look too hard at who wanted to invest in them and continued economic cooperation with the Third Reich for the duration of the war. But Germany didn't just need Switzerland, Switzerland needed Germany, as the Nazis provided much of the coal Switzerland needed to keep running. Even so, Switzerland was determined to stay neutral by any means necessary. Neither power was happy about this small European state firmly maintaining its neutrality and aiding their enemy. Both the Allied and Axis powers imposed trade blockades on Switzerland, but Switzerland stayed firm. They never invaded another country, but that didn't mean they didn't engage in fighting. Their troops stood at the watch on their border, and strength and skills of the Swiss army deterred Hitler from invading. But both the Allies and the Germans would frequently violate Swiss airspace, seeking shortcuts, and the Swiss would respond. It was common for the Swiss to shoot down planes that entered their airspace, until the government decided to intercept, land, and capture them instead. Switzerland's neutrality also made it an inviting target for other reasons. For the many people displaced by the Nazis, they sought a new country to take them in. The problem, especially for Jews fleeing persecution, was that the Nazis would often follow them to their new home. This is what happened to Anne Frank when her family's refuge of the Netherlands was invaded. But in Switzerland, there was little chance of an invasion. Jewish refugees flooded to Switzerland, but Switzerland was notoriously stingy with granting amnesty, and many of the refugees either found themselves interned in displaced person camps, deported, or faced harsh restrictions that kept them from settling in the country. While Switzerland maintained its neutrality successfully through the war, historians have since criticized many of their tactics. But for many of the countries in World War II, they hoped that they were too small to be noticed. Europe has 5 microstates, tiny nations smaller than many cities around the world. Today, they're elite vacation destinations, but during the war, they were more like ants amid a pair of battling elephants. So how did they survive? By staying out of it, as best they could. The largest of them, Andorra, was located right between occupied Vichy France and Francisco Franco's fascist Spain. Spain was not a part of the war, but Andorra was not connected to any Allied power and had little chance to resist. To avoid invasion, its General Council largely took on a policy of passive cooperation. They didn't make it easy to enter the microstate and expelled those refugees who made it in. The country also became a valuable smuggling route from France to Spain, but still managed to avoid invasion. However, inside the country, a small anti-fascist sentiment emerged. Secret resistance networks cropped up to aid refugees of the Nazi regime and Allied military members seeking an escape from enemy territory. This next country probably hoped it was mistaken as parts of Switzerland. Liechtenstein isn't just the longest country name in all of Europe, it's also one of the smallest countries. The mountainous region borders Austria and Switzerland and is a wealthy country with a strong banking sector. Like Switzerland, it hoped to stay out of the combat entirely and was mostly successful. It formed an informal alliance with Switzerland, brought many of the royal family's treasures home for safekeeping, and was largely too small and not strategically useful enough to be invaded. Ironically, its trouble came mostly after the war. Liechtenstein had a small Nazi movement and struggled to put it down. In the aftermath, Czechoslovakia and Poland moved to seize what they determined were German holdings in Liechtenstein, time, including a significant chunk of farmland and forest. In the aftermath, Liechtenstein survived the war and managed to keep its position as a wealthy European haven, but the coming Cold War would bring more tensions to its borders. Some places the party never stops, but did that continue during World War II? Monaco is a passport to luxury in the modern day, with its central city of Monte Carlo known as one of the wealthiest places in the world. Known for its gambling scene, the constitutional monarchy is located in the south of France, and during World War II that left it surrounded on three sides by Nazi occupation. Monaco had only a small military delegation and no way to resist an invasion, so it wasn't a big surprise when they were invaded. First came Italy, which imposed a fascist regime under Mussolini. When the dictator fell out with the Axis powers and was later overthrown, the Germans marched in, and many prominent Jewish figures within Monaco's rich art scene found themselves targeted, deported, or killed. While Monaco had no large army to defend itself with, an underground resistance cell did form, and the country returned to democracy after being liberated. But in Italy, not one but two stands for neutrality were being fought. San Marino is one of the smallest countries in the world, a microstate only 24 square miles surrounded by Italy. And as Italy turned fascist under Benito Mussolini and joined the Axis powers, their attention turned to the strange sovereign enclave within their borders. San Marino intended to stay neutral, but this was nearly ruined when the New York Times falsely reported that they had declared war on Great Britain. A hurried telegram to the British fended off any conflict, but the San Marino government at the time did largely align with Mussolini. After the governments in both countries collapsed in 1943, the new San Marino government sought to stay neutral. Things went downhill from there as the Royal Air Force mistakenly bombed the country, and it was later turned into a flashpoint when Allied and Axis forces did battle there in 1944. The state would also become a haven for refugees, and their troubled experience during the war proved that it's hard to stay neutral when you're in the middle of another country. But would anyone dare to declare war on the Pope? The smallest country in the world, Vatican City, is more of an enclave for the Roman Catholic religion and its leader, the Pope. In World War II, Vatican City was firmly neutral under the leadership of Pope Pius XII. Located within the city of Rome, the Vatican faced a difficult balancing act to avoid invasion by the Axis powers while also not compromising their faith. From before the war broke out, the Vatican was trying to mediate peace. It didn't go so well. During the war, Pius XII consistently condemned Nazi aggression and persecution, with prominent Roman Catholic figures in Germany and Nazi-occupied territories being targeted by Hitler. Hitler was enraged by the Pope's comments and briefly considered targeting him, but was talked out of it. Today, historians debate about Pius XII's role in the Holocaust. Were his strong public condemnations and covert humanitarian aid enough, or did he fail to live up to his responsibilities to the refugees? If the Pope's goal was to protect the Catholic haven, he succeeded. While Rome was invaded by the Nazis in 1943, Vatican City remained untouched. And halfway around the world, other countries were struggling to stay out of the fray. The nation of Tibet had enough to worry about as war broke out around the world. The mountainous region's independence was disputed internationally as it was claimed by China. The Dalai Lama, its Buddhist ruler, wanted to keep the country out of the fray, and it had no interest in getting involved in the conflict between China and Japan. However, as the battle ramped up and World War II swept around the world, Tibet hosted agents from the Allies several times. British and American military officers visited the Himalayan nation, but Tibet didn't have any reason to officially join the fray. They were more concerned with internal affairs and the growing civil war in China. As the war ended, tensions between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong reached a boiling point. The communists were left as the victors. Tibet had successfully stayed out of the war, but it wouldn't help them maintain their independence. They were annexed by China in 1951. But how did one of the world's most war-torn countries manage to stay out of the war? Afghanistan became known as the graveyard of empires, as mighty superpowers have been humbled on its desert battlefields. Why is it so difficult to conquer? A combination of rough terrain, locals who know it well and are experts at guerrilla warfare, and complex political and ethnic divisions that make it hard to install a stable government. But all these factors may have actually worked in the country's favor in World War II. Afghanistan was an independent nation at the time and a member of the League of Nations. Under King Mohammad Zahir Shah, the country chose not to align with either side of the conflict. While it did originally have diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany, it chose to sever them in 1941 to make it clear to the Allies that it was not aligned with them and to avoid a potential invasion. Ultimately, Afghanistan was not of interest to either side to risk an invasion, but the end of the war would only mean more turmoil for the country in the future. And one country might have been a cautionary tale for Afghanistan. In the 1930s, Iran was quickly modernizing under Reza Shah. The Shah wanted to maintain a neutral stance in conflicts and relied heavily on foreign funds to finance his infrastructure projects. Iran had one major resource: oil. And when the black gold is involved, trouble follows. Iran was able to stay out of the war until shortly after Operation Barbarossa, as the Soviets were invaded by Nazi Germany. They soon aligned with the Allied powers, and all parties worried about the Iran-USSR supply chain. So the Allies decided to do something about it and put together an invasion of Iran in 1941. Ostensibly, this was to secure Iran's oil fields and preempt a possible Axis invasion, but the Allies also felt that Reza Shah was too pro-Nazi and that his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, would be a friendlier ruler. The war only lasted 6 days, with the outgunned Iranians agreeing to surrender. Iran was occupied for the remainder of the war and aided the war effort but never actually declared war on either side. For some countries, the war was completely inconsequential. Bhutan and Yemen couldn't be more different as countries, but they had one thing in common. Both were able to stay fully neutral through the entirety of World War II. Bhutan, the small Himalayan kingdom, was partially under British control at the time, but didn't get involved in the war and was never invaded. Yemen had been involved in conflict with the British around the same time period, as well as a war with Saudi Arabia 10 years earlier, but the Arab state was one of many in the region that managed to stay out of the war and never had it land on its own soil. Other countries like Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and Turkey stayed neutral until the last months of the war when they joined the Allies, but had little to no involvement in the ground wars that were tearing apart Europe and Asia at the time. But for some European countries, the path to neutrality was more complicated. For Ireland, World War II was complicated. While they were still technically a dominion of the British Empire, the Irish War of Independence 20 years earlier had given them much more autonomy. Notably, a British declaration of war did not bring them in as well. Their leader, Eamon de Valera, did not want any part of British conflicts, and the public supported his calls for neutrality, despite there being more than 50,000 Irish citizens in the British Army. When Germany invaded Poland and World War II was on, Ireland stuck by its choice to stay neutral, despite many saying they had a moral obligation to fight Nazism. The state chose not just to practice neutrality but to enforce it, with the government censoring activists that advocated entering the war and banning any actions that deemed to be belligerent. However, staying out of the war would prove to be complicated. Ireland could declare itself to be neutral, but it couldn't move itself out of the way of the war. The country had a few ships of its own, and the waters surrounding it were now a combat zone, making it difficult for the island to get supplied. German planes didn't discriminate, and several air raids hit the island. Ireland's ships were often attacked by both Allied and Axis forces as well. While de Valera was believed to be nominally pro-Allies, he resisted all pressure to join the war, even rejecting an offer by the British to support a united Ireland after the war in exchange for assistance. Ireland did successfully maintain its neutrality throughout the war, although the island paid a terrible price for its proximity to one of the most brutal battlefields. Today, most historians believe Ireland likely spared itself worse pain by avoiding the ire of the Nazis, although they have been criticized for their failure to provide aid to Jewish refugees. But one area of Europe surprisingly chose a very different path. Portugal might look like a small slice of land on the west coast of Iberia, but as the 1940s approached, it was still a global power and controlled colonies in Africa and Asia. They had historically been closely aligned with Britain, but as World War II ramped up, they chose to stay neutral, mostly due to their close proximity to Spain, who would align with the Axis powers. The 550-year Anglo-Portuguese alliance was strong, but Portugal was a small nation without their powerful domestic army needed to be a game-changer in the war. Thus, Portugal kept their eyes on the border, and with Spain on one side and the sea on the other, the Portuguese knew they needed to keep their neighbor happy. One key point of contention was the Azores, a small group of islands in the Atlantic controlled by Portugal that both sides believed would be a useful strategic location to build bases. But as the war raged on, neutral Portugal would have to make some hard decisions. Portugal was pulling off a tricky balancing act throughout the war. They'd signed a non-aggression pact with the new Spanish government in 1939, but were also providing vital aid to Britain. As only one of the English-friendly countries that weren't involved in the war, they were a source of credit and goods. They also provided a haven for refugees and maintained this delicate dance until 1944. Then, with the tide of the war turning, they agreed to let the United States establish a military base in the Azores. While this didn't force them to enter the war, it did change their status from neutral to non-belligerent. Throughout the war, both the Nazis and the Allies considered making moves against Portugal to secure its vital resources for themselves, but Portugal made themselves useful to all sides, and it paid off, allowing their oceanfront homeland to escape the war intact. But right next door, the situation was much more complicated. Fascism was having a streak of success in Europe in the 1930s, and joining Hitler and Mussolini was General Francisco Franco, who led a nationalist revolt against the Second Spanish Republic and became a dictator in 1939. He quickly put the military in charge and began a brutal campaign of persecuting communists and other dissidents. As World War II ramped up, Franco seemed an ideal ally for Axis powers, but instead he chose to keep Spain out of the war. This wasn't for lack of interest. Franco wasn't willing to put Spanish troops on the line unless he got something in exchange, and Hitler wasn't interested in helping him establish colonies abroad. While he provided aid to the Axis powers in non-military ways, the Spanish army was mostly stationed around the country to deter the Nazis from taking a Spanish vacation once they'd conquered France. And much like Portugal, Spain was pulling off a tricky balancing act. Spain switched from neutral to non-belligerent to neutral through the war, and as the war shifted to the Eastern Front, Franco's forces became less important to the conflict. While the government was loosely aligned with the Axis, Allied pressure got them to limit exports to Germany in the later days of the war, and Franco could see the writing on the wall. While no Spanish troops were ever committed to the conflict, Franco did allow a division of volunteers to join the war on the side of the Axis, but only against the Soviets, keeping the delicate peace with Britain and the United States intact. Spain became a hub for espionage and escape during the war, as one of the few countries on the European mainland not under Nazi occupation, and Franco's decision paid dividends for him. While Mussolini was overthrown by his own people and Hitler died in a cold bunker as the Allies closed in on him, Franco remained in control until his death in 1975, and the fascist leader maintained a strong base of support, likely bolstered by his success in keeping the country out of the war. For more on the complex political dealings of the war, check out modern companies that collaborated with Nazis during World War II, or watch this video instead.